everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I remember one time when I was a kid, I was watching Saturday Night Live, and Bill Pullman of Spaceballs fame, and I think at the time this episode came out, he had recently been in Mr. Wrong, where I think his character name alongside Ellen DeGeneres was Whitman. I'm pretty sure that's who he was in that show. He's a psychopath, and it was really funny. Bill Pullman was a big deal at this point. You would want to watch a Saturday Night Live episode with Bill Pullman. And I remember this one skit, he comes out, and I had to look up the name. It's John Heyward. He comes out, and he's like, "Hello, I'm John Heyward, and I'm super, super rich. But I wasn't always a good guy until I discovered the Bible, and especially this passage." And then he goes and reads Matthew 19, the stuff that you and I are working on this week. And particularly, he picks it up right where we left off yesterday. Jesus tells the rich young ruler, "Sell all your possessions, give it to the poor, then come follow me." And the rich young ruler walks away because he's sad, because he had great wealth. And then in the Saturday Night Live skit, then Jesus said to his disciples, "I tell you the truth, it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." And then Bill Pullman's character goes on to be like, "That passage changed my world, and it caused me to decide to start using my billions for good. That's why I started the Heyward Foundation, for figuring out how to get a camel to fit through the eye of a needle." And then he takes you on this tour of his lab, and he's like, "Oh, this guy over here is figuring out how to puree a camel to see if he can pour it through the eye of a needle." It's a pretty good joke, but for me it was particularly funny because I think it was right in the middle of a class on the New Testament as I was watching this skit. And in this class, we had just talked about the interpretations of this passage, which I think comes up in all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And how throughout time, different cultures, different expressions of Christianity had tried to find ways to change the meaning of this passage. In other words, there have been a whole bunch of John Heyward, Bill Pullman's character, a lot of these Heyward types who've come along and been like, "No, it clearly doesn't mean what it looks like it means. It means something different," which raises two questions. One, upon close inspection, what does it actually look like it means? And two, what are some of the funny things that have happened through the years to try to make it mean something different than that? So let's start with the easier one, which is just, what does the thing actually mean? And I say easy because I really don't think it's that difficult in light of all the context of the stuff we've been looking at. What we're seeing is, again, that equation that we've been talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks. This weird equation about how people don't really have anything unique to bring to God that he couldn't create for himself. And even if somebody wanted to push back there and be like, "Well, no, and people can give God their worship." But even that Jesus speaks to in Luke 19 when he's like, "Look, if people don't worship me, the stones will cry out." What he's saying is, he can make things that point to his glory and kingness and awesomeness out of thin air, which is a further reminder of the complete self-sustainability of a perfectly unlimited deity who's not bound by anything. This equation, then, for how one enters the kingdom of heaven says there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can buy. No one can be righteous enough. No one can be perfect enough to get rid of their imperfection. The imperfect cannot re-perfect itself. Some outside actor who has access to perfection would have to come in and break the rules almost of logic to re-perfect the imperfect, and therefore to fully unite the imperfect made perfect with the perfect. Man, that was a lot of words, but hopefully you're tracking with what I'm saying. Let me take one more run at it. According to what we've seen so far in Matthew, if anybody is going to go from being a world citizen outside the kingdom, outside of a relationship with the king, to a kingdom citizen inside the kingdom in a relationship with the king, that would have to be achieved by the work of the king extending grace and forgiveness and welcoming to that individual, not by the work of that individual banging down the doors of the kingdom with their resume in their hand, waving it about how good they are and how they've earned their way. Jesus makes it clear that that just isn't a currency that carries any value in the kingdom. So this young man shows up, and wealth and privilege are things that he is pointing to. That's the resume he's waving in his hand. And Jesus shoots it down by demonstrating that he doesn't understand or embrace the values of the kingdom. He doesn't understand who the king is. He's not assuming a right posture before the king. He just doesn't get it at this point. And he goes away sad. And so then when Jesus turns to the disciples and says, it's tough for a rich man to get it, guys, paraphrase his mind, what he's saying is, you just saw someone try to use a substitute currency to purchase their way into the kingdom, and it doesn't work. The only thing that has currency, the only thing that bears the righteousness of God is the righteousness of God. And then Jesus doubles down on this using hyperbole, a trick that we've seen him use before in Matthew chapter 13, when he talks about a mustard seed, starting in verse 31. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it's the smallest of all your seeds, yet when it grows, it's the largest of the garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds of the air come and perch in its branches. He's trying to pick something that everybody knows about, that's really little, that gets really big. Jesus constantly uses hyperbole. He just used hyperbole a little while ago when he's like, hey, if your eye causes you to sin, just pluck that thing out. Better to go into heaven blind than to miss out on the kingdom of heaven with both eyes intact. And that was just like a chapter ago in chapter 18. So in this situation, it's pretty easy to see the rhetorical techniques Jesus is using again. What's the biggest animal that would be walking around everywhere that everybody in his audience would know? It'd be a camel. It's a beast of burden. It's not some wild animal. Everybody would have seen a camel. They would have been used to having these things around. That's the biggest animal you would see on a regular basis. And like, what's the tiniest opening that anybody in the audience could imagine that everybody would think of as being, oh yeah, no, there's some daylight in there, but whoa, you got to look real close. I have a needle, right? I mean, that's why we have a billion expressions for that. Like, oh, he tried to thread the needle, but couldn't do it because we can't think of anything that's narrower than a needle. So he just took the biggest thing he could think of and the smallest opening he could think of that everybody would know. It's like he's trying to mash that thing through that thing, and you can't do it. Even if you puree a camel, it doesn't count. Even if you got that thing through there one drop at a time, because this isn't a technical description of physics that Jesus is going with. Come on, everybody gets it except for the Heyward guy, and he looks like an idiot, and that's why the joke works, because obviously Jesus isn't saying if you can do it, it unlocks some secret next level black magic power that gets you into the kingdom and makes your money not a problem. And see, the joke from Saturday Night Live works even better here. If that's what you're asking and that's how you're trying to respond, it proves that Jesus' teaching was getting it right in the first place, because it never occurs to the Heyward guy in that skit that maybe he should just drop the shtick and assume a position of humility, or, I mean, even further from his mind, maybe you just need to part ways with some of your money or your stuff because clearly it's clouding your judgment and you don't have a right sense of self or the deity on the other side of that book that you're holding up in the skit. Now, look, there are some parts of the Bible that you and I have been through and some parts coming up that we're going to go through where it's like, man, that is brutally difficult, and I am just not quite sure what to do with it or how it fits. And so all I can do is give you 4 or 5 things that smart people say from different positions, and we'll just do our best to see what makes sense for each of us as we go along. But I don't think this is one of those passages. In light of everything else we've been looking at, in light of how much the text seems to be drilling down here in the last couple of chapters on what the equation truly is between God and man, between the people who would aspire to be in the kingdom and the king himself, the more we get a sense of that, the more we read this little passage in context, the more it's clear that this is contributing to and illustrating, fleshing out this difficult to understand equation that Jesus is talking about. Human awesomeness and world kingdom currency does not buy access to the new family of faith. You can buy literally anything else with it, but you can't buy the kingdom with that currency. There is no way I'm going to shortchange us on looking at a couple of the goofier ways to try to get out of this text, meaning what this text means, that people have come up with through the years. So we're just going to take all day tomorrow and do that, and it will be fun. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. We'll do this again soon.